The world has turned dangerous. Is the United States prepared to meet the new challenges it might face? In this special series from the President's Inbox, we're bringing you conversations with Washington insiders to assess whether the United States is ready for a new, more dangerous world. How long could the United States fight if a major power war began tomorrow? Can the United States replenish its weapons stocks quickly and reliably? Can it supply its allies and partners in time of need? During World War II, the United States was the arsenal of democracy, arming itself and its allies to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But since the Cold War ended, America's defense industrial base has atrophied, while procurement costs have ballooned. The production of new weapons regularly runs behind schedule and over budget, even as the war in Ukraine has shown that sustained warfare can quickly deplete weapon stocks. Can America's defense industrial base be rebuilt? Or will doubts about Washington's ability to sustain its military force invite aggression? From the Council on Foreign Relations, welcome to the President's Inbox. I'm Jim Lindsay. Joining me today is Kathleen Hicks, former Deputy Secretary of Defense and a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and at Johns Hopkins University's Kissinger Center for Global Affairs. Kath, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, Jim, it's a pleasure to be here. And I do want to just give the Chicago Council on Global Affairs a shout out, since I'm also a distinguished fellow there.
Okay, sorry to have missed it.
No. I don't want them to feel left out.
Who is the president of the council. But I'm glad to have you here with your multiple affiliations. And I guess where I'd like to begin, Kath, if we may, is can you help me understand what we mean by the term defense industrial base? I went a couple decades without anyone worrying about the defense industrial base. And now it seems like every week I get an invitation to go and talk about the defense industrial base. I suspect many people are like me. So help me understand what we're actually talking about.
Sure. So isn't that just the best encapsulation of the problem set and not unusual in the US system, right? We go 20 years not paying attention to something, and then suddenly the problem is right in front of us. And that's a pretty good summation of what's going on with the so-called defense industrial base. The first thing I would say is it's best to think about the defense industrial base as really just a reflection of the broader industrial base. DoD has so many different needs and requirements, and it acquires everything from, say, toilet paper to sustaining bases, to high-end operational capabilities, military-specific capabilities. And often when folks are talking about the defense industrial base, they're talking about the piece of that industrial support that is more specific to DoD operational applications. And that has traditionally, in the last 20 plus years, been dominated by a set of prime contractors. And increasingly across partisan aisles, we've been focused on bringing more and more solutions to bear from the commercial sector, particularly non-traditional suppliers for defense. And that's because much of the innovation that used to be government generated first in the United States, and typically those federal dollars were coming from the Defense Department itself, are now being generated from the commercial sector. So the 70-30 split is the way to think of it. The Defense Department used to provide about 70% of overall research and development. Now it's flipped to the commercial sector, essentially providing 70% of that.
Okay, so Catherine, we're talking about the big defense contractors, the five primes. We're talking about Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Raytheon, correct?
And more. I think even when you're thinking defense industrial base, it is not just the primes. It is those who are supplying the needs of the Defense Department, but really folks tend to focus on what are those operational needs that the department has, which is a mix. I mentioned the 70-30. The other big split shift to think about is hardware, software. We now live in an age where so much of the development potential is on the software side, particularly as you can quickly upgrade hardware that you've bought. So those traditional primes that you've mentioned, they themselves are focused on software and hardware. But think about all the software providers that you didn't name that are really important to the development of capability, everywhere from the Googles to a Palantir and others who are bringing software solutions to defense.
Besides Google and Palantir, we have Microsoft, Amazon,
Right.
SpaceX, Anduril, and a lot of other sort of high-tech firms operating in this space. When you think about the defense industrial base, Kath, do you also include government-owned arsenals, factories, and depots?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what's called our organic industrial base. And they are very important, especially you can think about specific areas in support of our naval warfare and munitions in general, particularly army munitions, but not just exclusively. And a lot of times those are actually operated by contractors. They're so-called government-owned contractor operated. And in DoD, we have to have an acronym for everything. So that's a GOCO. So even those organic industrial base elements have a heavy influence and partnership requirement with the commercial sector.
So, Kath, there's been a lot of talk about the defense industrial base. One article that came out recently in The Atlantic was titled "The Crumbling Foundation of America's Military." I will note that it doesn't seem like a couple weeks go by without reading the news story about the challenges the DoD has with its procurement programs. I'll note that the Navy proposed building 2 Virginia-class attack submarines annually with a goal of eventually getting up to 3 a year. Instead, the program is producing, I think, roughly 1.2 subs a year because of workforce shortages and supply chains. So when we talk about the weaknesses of the defense industrial base, how big a problem is it?
Let me first say, if I were looking relatively around the globe at what military, I'd pick in my draft, the United States would absolutely be at the top of the list. And that's both because of the inherent potential and capability, experienced capability that we have in our force, and it's the force's ability to bring to bear a capability. That capability might be expressed in high tech, it might be low tech, it doesn't matter. The point is how you apply it at the edge in order to deter adversaries. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, yes, we have tremendous challenges across the United States industrial base. And the Defense Department is a reflection of that. We rely on the same talent base, STEM talent. You can think of skills, trades, welders is a great example that are where shortages plague the overall economy. We have the same problem. So I say it that way just because too often I think we focus on the defense piece of the defense industrial base. Whereas if you look more broadly, you now have broad bipartisan support, I think, for manufacturing challenges here at home. Think of the CHIPS and Science Act, for instance. So we're really relying in the defense community on that broader industrial base. Now you get into things like shipbuilding, to use your example. And it is an excellent, sadly, example of where the United States from about 1960-ish kind of stepped away from the table. And in that case, it was Japan and Korea who stepped in, eventually China. And now China is quite dominant in terms of its amount of investment and then production of ships. The goal for the United States isn't necessarily to want to build as many ships as China. The goal is to deliver on time and on budget. Those things our warfighters need in case of defense at the price point that the taxpayers have essentially agreed to. And that is not working. That system is not working. The challenges there, again, you can extrapolate this to other areas, are indeed workforce, although we are seeing in places that increased pay makes a big difference. So it's not, rocket science, if you will. But we also have very significant supply chain fragility. COVID showed that all throughout the economy. And in the Biden administration in 2021, so predating Ukraine, we had identified this, particularly coming out of COVID, these workforce challenges, supply chain challenges, major problems for the defense sector. Then Ukraine happened, and I think that really exposed a much broader cross-section of Americans and their representatives in Congress and folks outside the defense sector who care about national security to the challenges we were facing. And shipbuilding, I think, is a place people can see that in a very tangible way, but it's not the only place where those challenges are expressing themselves.
So, Kath, I take the point that the United States has the ability to design things. It's not clear we have the capability we need to manufacture things. And that is, I think, a broader problem for the U.S. economy. I want to talk a little bit about how we got here, specifically in terms of the Defense Department and its needs, which is not simply building big platforms like aircraft carriers or attack submarines or tanks, but it's the munitions that they're going to use. And I will note, I grew up not far away from the Watertown Arsenal, which is a long-standing U.S. Army facility. I believe now it's a mixed-use development with a mall and various entertainment facilities. But how do we go from being the arsenal of democracy where the United States could more than supply itself and its friends to this situation where all of a sudden we've discovered that we may have supply chain vulnerabilities or no capacity to be able to do things, produce things quickly. And I think that was particularly notable for so-called, it was 150 millimeter shells once the war in Ukraine began. Our production rate was just a small sliver of what the Ukrainian army was expending on a daily basis. How did we get here?
Sure. So this doesn't have an easy answer. And I say that in part to excuse myself as I'm about to explain it, but also as folks are listening to think, as they think ahead to solutions, there aren't going to be really single point solutions. There's no silver bullet in solving the challenges that we face. The decisions that the United States has made, I use the shipbuilding example of 1964, and I use that on purpose because often we tend to point to China's rise exclusively. That is certainly a significant factor in the sense of relative lack of growth on the U.S. side. But you had, at least since the end of the Cold War, really decisions made to invest in other areas. And, it's over to others to think, who are outside the defense sector, to think about what those trade-offs were and did they pay off. We certainly had a very strong economy, for instance, through the 90s and other eras where we were making these decisions to have a peace dividend. We had base realignment and closures, to use your example, that had effects on the defense industrial base as well. We had consolidation. These were efficiencies, if you will, of their day. And they allowed, I'm sure, for reinvestment in other areas. So I don't want to judge those choices, but I will say the effect of those choices are really what we see here today. And then let me just add the global supply chain, which again creates a lot of efficiency, has other positive attributes. But what we found is that, certainly by the time I came back to the department, my third time in the department, beginning in 2021, most major manufacturers at the C-suite level, at the uppermost levels, I found would be hard pressed to know at their fingertips what their own supply chains were for an area like munitions. Munitions was not their most profitable area. The Defense Department didn't have a steady funding stream for it. So, they could turn on and off factories or supply lines when directed or asked and contracted with, but it wasn't their focus. And so to your point, what you found in munitions, and this was from late Obama, I think, through the first Trump administration into the Biden administration, there already had been a significant focus on how do we get more investment into munitions. By the time the Ukraine crisis happened, while you had that energy in the system, the end result of it had not yet produced. And the supplementals provided for, congressional supplementals funding provided for Ukraine, a lot of that money went into improving the U.S. defense industrial base. So those, Americans who put their tax dollars forward that went into those supplemental funds, that a lot of that 10 billion plus came back to the U.S. to create better manufacturing capability, more robotics investment, workforce improvements, more lines opened, and now 155 millimeter artillery is a good example. Now we're on a much stronger basis. And that shows you some of what it takes. These are policy choices at the national level. Some of what it takes to build out that defense industrial base, and that it takes a while. It is not as simple as pulling out your dollar, going to the vending machine, pushing the Snickers button and having it drop out the bottom. If a policy decision is made today, back to the president's inbox format here, that you want more, whatever it's going to be, Tomahawk missiles, JDAMs, F-35s, any kind of complex system, more ships, you have to think about everything that goes into delivering that, the accountability and oversight, the workforce, the supply chain, multiple sources, before you can have an expectation that it's going to deliver right away.
Well, I think it's an important point there when you go back looking at history. When the wall fell in Berlin and we had the end of the Cold War, as you rightly point out, I think politically, a lot of people wanted to have a peace dividend. In fact, the war was over. It was hard to make the case that great power war was just around the corner, so we should keep producing these weapons. I will note that then Secretary of Defense Les Aspin had a meeting with leading members of defense contractors in 1993. I believe it was dubbed the Last Supper because he told them, look, where we're going with the peace dividend, we can't sustain a large defense contracting establishment. You're going to have to consolidate. Now we're living with the consequences. And likewise, part of the challenge is that we've discovered that having global supply chains is great for efficiency, but they may not be resilient and indeed may create opportunities for your very adversaries to be able to squeeze you. But it seems that another part of what's happening right now is that there's sort of a change in our understanding of conflict. I mean, it seemed for years the United States military predicated its strategy and notion that we would be able to overmatch anyone we faced, that they may have more weapons, that we would have much better weapons. And I think we saw that logic play out in the Gulf War and then in the Iraq War, where the quality of U.S. weapons, precision munitions, among other things, and the advantage we had in sensors, intelligence, satellites, and the rest gave us a decided advantage. So now we're in a war or a world in which it looks like cheaper and smaller may overwhelm better and more expensive, given just the challenges of being overwhelmed by drones. I think there's been a lot of talk about the effort against the Houthis in the Red Sea. We're shooting missiles that cost $1 million apiece against basically missiles they whipped up for far, far less. How does that play a role in all of this?
Sure. Let me step back one on the supply chain piece just to emphasize that in the defense industrial base proper, the specific, those parts of the defense industrial base for which there's not a broad commercial application, a lot of the challenges are actually a small business, single one point small businesses here in the US, where the Defense Department is their, major customer, and the customer itself is not a consistent provider. So you can think about the many, either recently, of course, a shutdown, but really continuing resolutions DoD has been under, things of that sort that really make it hard for those small businesses to survive. And so they opt out. There are easier ways to make money, right? And then you don't have any suppliers. So I just really want to emphasize that, because I do think we get focused on the China in the supply chain, which is certainly a major issue, but there's also this really fragile base here in the U.S. that we have to support.
Well, just note on that point, though, Congress does not seem to be willing to get its own act together and produce budgets, even on the timeline that they're pledged to, once every year, and talk about having longer term budgeting has never gone anywhere.
That's exactly right. And you tend to see the folks who are on the oversight committees for defense, whether authorizers or appropriators, they're very seized with the need to get the funding out there. But they are not, that they're an advocacy group, if you will, for defense within the system. So I don't think, broadly speaking, the effects of this, the erosive effects over time and in all these ways, it's just not penetrating at the political level. I think it really has begun to do so. So I think there's a moment of opportunity. To your point on the types of capabilities, yeah, the character of warfare is always changing. And what we've seen in Ukraine is, a strategy for the Ukrainians that has relied very much on what they can get their hands on. And that has been heavy toward attritable autonomy as an example. And, you may know I'm very supportive of attritable autonomy, having launched the Replicator initiative at DoD.
We'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah, but I want to really stress that the answer is not one or the other. The answer is, for the U.S., probably what you think of as a high-low mix. It is about a yes and strategy. We have major investments in, I'll call them exquisite or high-end systems that are really valuable to the United States and how we think about deterring and, if needed, defeating an adversary who comes up against U.S. interests. But what these new capabilities, and again, this is just one example, but I'd say software defined capabilities in general leading toward autonomy, what those things can help us do is start to shift those cost exchange ratios you pointed out on, say, for missiles and missile defense. So they need to be woven in. We're not currently in the desperate situation Ukrainians are. The way we would choose to fight won't look like the way that the Ukrainians have to fight. But what we want to make sure is that the things we believe or the warfighter tells us they need, we can get delivered to them. And that is the real crux of where the industrial base is underperforming.
Now, Kat, you've laid out a number of reasons why we've ended up in the situation that we're in. Partly it's because of the way Congress budgets, partly it's because we're seeking efficiencies, partly because companies have greener pastures to do their production, overall decline in America's manufacturing base. I would also note, particularly in the case of organics, like those Army depots, many of them sort of went by the wayside because we were happy to offshore. A lot of that production was incredibly dirty. I think the EPA has something like 600 Army weapons sites on its Superfund list because making some of these weapons produces undesirable residue. But I want to come back to one aspect of our challenge that you alluded to, and that's the issue of skilled tradespeople. Because my sense is that most people don't focus on that part of the issue. And I'm struck because I was talking to people at Electric Boat up in Groton, where they build the fast attack submarines. And I said what seemed to be the obvious thing since I took economics back in college, just pay your people more. And the answer I got was, you got two problems. One, supply isn't that great. Second is cost of living here is very expensive. So even if we pay above average wages, these people look and say, but I can stay somewhere else, which is lower cost place to live, and I won't have to travel an hour to get to work. How do you get around this issue of not having enough people who can do it? Because you just don't walk, to Electric Boat one day and say, hey, I can weld steel, or I could be an electrician.
There are a variety of solutions, most of which are already in play. So I'm not suggesting anything that isn't already being tried. You've mentioned one, of course, which is the pay itself. We have seen lower cost of living areas. So you can think in particular the southeast of the United States. So we have, shipbuilding in that region as well, doing better with retaining skills. And one could suppose it's cost of living. But I rush to add that as it happens all across the country, individual workers are weighing different things, education for their children, healthcare. So making sure that any given region is really focused on how to attract the workforce they need. And welders are, we're talking about that because I think it's a very clear skill set problem, but there are many other trades. That is an area where I have seen a lot of momentum region by region. So in the Northeast, you're pointing to, they are especially well organized.
Groton, I should say, is in Connecticut.
Yes, in Connecticut, correct. So the Northeast is well organized as a region to think about their community college system, their K through 12 system, their all these kind of feeders, training regimens. How do they help provide support at the state and local level? So each region's, each state, each locality is going to have a little bit of a different approach, but that's one set of answers. Another set of answers, of course, particularly on the engineering side, maybe a little less on the skilled trade side, is the immigration policy and H-1B visa policy, which is important. STEM improvements here in the United States in general, training and retraining programs in general. And then the last thing I'll say really is the robotics revolution in manufacturing. And in addition to that, advanced manufacturing processes, both of which reduce the need for, don't remove, but reduce the need for particularly specialized talent. And those we are very far behind. This is where the Koreans and Japanese, for instance, on shipbuilding are much further ahead. It's not just about the Chinese. So what Hanwha, which has now is now working out of the Philly shipyard, the old Philly shipyard, they are bringing a lot of those techniques and approaches here to the United States. That's the kind of working with your allies and partners who have learned and done better, bringing that in, and then turning to the commercial sector where there are some good examples of it taking advantage of advanced manufacturing and robotics. You can think of the auto industry, others, to improve our position.
Kath, how much of the problem can be laid at the doorsteps of the military services themselves? There's a long history, a long literature of complaints about the military not being able to make up its mind about what it wants to build, continually changing things along the way. I'll point to, the USS Constellation frigate program, which was curtailed last month by the Trump administration. I think the original idea was to build frigates based on what I understood to be a fairly well-developed French-Italian design, and the Navy kept tinkering with it until it became too expensive and didn't move forward. And again, this is not a new problem. I can recall back in the early 1980s reading a book by Jim Fallows that talked about the development of the M16 rifle and how difficult it was to get people to sign off because so many people had a swing at the ball. So to what extent are the services themselves complicit in this problem?
I just want to separate the two issues. I think requirements creep is what we usually call that. Mission creep or requirements creep is a real challenge set. And to the extent that we can learn from the commercial sector in terms of pushing out 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 improvements, major asterisks that are safe for the service member, because safety is obviously a huge priority. I think we are better off. And it is absolutely the case that, adding requirements is a time-honored tradition that ends up getting you nowhere. That is absolutely the case. Whose fault is that? I think is a much more complex answer. And it is a combination. It's almost never the service on its own. And it's almost never the uniform military on its own. It's often a mix of civilian, military, inside the executive branch. You might have OMB, you might have the NSC, you could imagine others inside the executive branch. And then, of course, Congress itself is a many-headed hydra of interests on those requirements. And they might stipulate specifically in legislation in ways that make that more complicated, more hands inside the system. Some might say, obviously, they're doing appropriate oversight by way of doing that. And then you have things that are not actually written into law, but are more the product of back and forth. And finally, of course, you have the commercial sector and industry. You have the period of selection or pre-selection where different entities are vying for that program and they might have particular commercial advantages that they're trying to bring to bear that cause that requirement to shift. Or that, they may just be a party to actually trying to help craft it, the requirement. So I think that is a major issue. And we are much better off, just to go back to the first thing I said, thinking in terms of classes, iterations, and trying to free up as much as possible with safety and quality and warfighter need at the forefront, clear up a lot of those excess requirements.
So, Kath, I take your point that there are a lot of contributors to the situation we currently find ourselves in terms of the defense industrial base. You've already alluded to some of the things that the federal government can do, state and local government can do, the services can do, Congress can do. But I'd like to just sort of close on this issue of what else can be done, and particularly draw you out a little bit about the idea behind the Replicator Initiative, how well you think it is going, what you think it can realistically achieve.
Sure. So the Replicator Initiative itself overall was really focused on this idea that you could take a specific capability area, bring to bear all the attention of the department's various elements that can affect it, create a realistic but ambitious goal, and drive the system at that. And in so doing, you were going to advance a capability in an area the warfighter was clamoring for and needed. And at the same time, you were shifting the culture of the system to one that's action-oriented, focused on executing against urgency instead of business as usual. So Replicator 1 was this attritable autonomy approach. And then Replicator 2, which we also launched before I left, the Secretary of Defense, then Lloyd Austin, had determined that Replicator 2 would be counter-unmanned aerial systems, so counter-UAS. And my best understanding from what the same media that you read is that those are both on track, that they are, or underway, that they are both priorities for the Trump administration. That doesn't surprise me because they're, priorities for the warfighter, so they're not political in any way. And you've seen with this administration, the second Trump administration, out of the gate, a strong focus on reform. So what worries me the most, which would worry me no matter what, it's a cause of always the worry of every deputy secretary of defense, I think, is execution, implementation. You have to stay laser focused all the way through the system. We talk a lot about, in defense acquisition, valleys of death. And that's about how you can have a capability, a company can go in at the beginning, let's say they go in at the research side and they have a prototype contract, but then they can never get it, all the way through a valley of death to field at scale. Well, that's because on the defense side, we are crossing these many different process owners, accountable individuals and organizations, and you really need a continual effort to drive continuity through that process, drive urgency to the very last stage, and deliver out the other end. So that's what I'm watching for right now, how well that will all deliver. And then on the Atlantic Council side, I am co-chairing with Mac Thornberry, who, as a Republican from Texas, was the chair of the House Armed Services Committee. He and I are co-chairing a Reforge Commission for the Atlantic Council. And that is really about watching what's happening here across the defense sector and using the comparison you opened with of World War II, the Forge effort. And now it's about how well are we going to do at Reforge efforts to improve our defense industrial base.
On that note, I'll close up the president's inbox for this week. My guest has been Kathleen Hicks, former Deputy Secretary of Defense and a senior fellow at both Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center and Johns Hopkins University's Kissinger Center for Global Affairs. Kath, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks very much, Jim.
Today's episode was produced by Justin Schuster, Molly McEnany, Marcus Zacharia, Director of Video, Jeremy Sherlick, and Director of Podcasting, Gabrielle Sierra. Production assistance was provided by Oscar Berry and Kalia Haddock.